Hello, folks. Thanks for tuning in for yet another great show. I received a couple of emails asking me if we're ever going to add a YouTube channel. So we already have a YouTube channel. Right now, it's only audio. In the future, we'll be uploading video episodes. We're going to make this podcast video as well. So all the interviews, you're going to be able to see me and the guests interact on YouTube. It should be fun. Just kind of building the infrastructure for that right now. It should take some time, but I'm hoping to roll that out towards probably the end of the year. So look out for that. I'll obviously keep you up to date and anything that happens. But as always, if you want to stay tuned on any updates, Twitter, Instagram, follow me there and I'll keep you in the loop. All right. This week we have Emily Schrader. Emily is the founder of Socialite Creative. She's also a columnist for the Jerusalem Post. And she is just force of nature that is not going to stop until she gets the truth out. And I applaud her and I applaud people like her that despite death threats, despite insults and everything else, she's still sticking true to what she knows is true, and she's out there on social media giving you the facts. You know, she has these amazing short videos where she debunks a lot of the misinformation and disinformation that is widely circulated on social media. She does an amazing job, which is very much needed when your numbers, if you're talking Israel, 12 to 14 million Jews worldwide, about 8 or so million Jews in Israel. Most of them have jobs, work a 9 to 5. They don't have time to go out and explain everything. And when you're talking about, in theory, the other side, it's over 1 billion people. So those are just astronomical numbers that it's really hard to compete. But luckily, people like Emily, they take the time, they debunk all the misinformation out there, or at least the most popular ones. And she puts out actual factual videos with actual information. So she's amazing. We covered as much as we could in about an hour or so. We talked about obviously all the misinformation on social media, a brief history of the area, what happened with Sheikh Jarrah, Middle Eastern North African Jews after 1948. As again, this would need 10 hours and we would maybe cover half of what we would need to talk about. So we had a little over an hour. We tried to get as much as we could into that hour. I think we made it pretty concise, but we did say that we might do it again in the future because there is so much information and so much stuff that we need to talk about. So if you guys like this episode, I'm definitely going to do another one with Emily in the future. Keep an open mind. Some of the stuff you may already know, some you may not, but keep an open mind. Perhaps there are things that you heard of before that you thought were true, and this is kind of going to go against that worldview. Again, all I'm saying is keep an open mind. We're giving you only the facts here. Nothing is made up. It's all fact. So I hope you enjoyed the episode and maybe learn something along the way. Without further ado, let me introduce this week's guest, Emily Schrader. Enjoy the episode, everyone.
The Genuinely Interested Podcast.
Hey, Emily.
Hi, how's it going?
Good. How you doing?
Good.
Thank you for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Always
you have the hardest job in the world. It seems like.
Which one?
You have, well, you know what? We'll get into that a little bit later, but you do seem to have a massive uphill battle, and almost a mountain that is almost impossible to climb. But, I'm glad that you are doing it. I'm glad that there are other people that are doing it because someone needs to do it. But we will get into all that a little bit later. So first, I want to talk about you, kind of give us maybe your background. Where were you born? how did you get into the current role that you're occupying, and maybe how would you even describe that role really?
We're only like 2 minutes in and you're already calling me an occupier.
Oh shit. Yeah. That's usually I usually wait like 20 minutes before I do that.
It's important. You have to lay the groundwork,
Exactly.
But no, I'm originally from Los Angeles, and all my family. And I was always very politically active from even in high school. And so I was very active on campus. I went to USC for my undergrad. I was very active on campus with political issues, but not so much Israel stuff, even though my family was, generically supportive of Israel. So I really got involved with, Israel issues and the Israel political issue when they had the Apartheid Week, so they call it, on campus. It was the Students for Justice in Palestine. Mm-hmm. And they're very extreme. Even now, they've gotten worse. They were very extreme even then, though. And I remember that I was walking across campus with my friend, and she came. We were walking by this apartheid setup, and it has all these really exaggerated and extreme claims against Israel. And I supported Israel politically because that was fit in with my political ideology, but I didn't really know the facts. So I was like, why are these people obsessed with Israel? Do they have nothing better to do? And on campus you have, of course you have the Arab Student Association. And I understand if it's a Palestinian group, why maybe, it's an issue for them. This is the Socialist Club. And I think even at the time, although they ended up being very pro-Israel by the end, but the Armenian Club, what do you have to do with the Israeli-Palestinian Club? Why are you here? What are you doing? And they were obsessed. They would stand out there all day and pass out their flyers with complete nonsense about Israel. And I was pissed. I was annoyed that they're wasting my time approaching me. And I said this to my friend, and she's like, maybe you should join the Students for Israel. And I was like, oh, I don't have time for that. Well, I did. And I guess the rest of time. Yeah, I found time. They annoyed me enough that I found time.
Yeah.
And I really I was already going to I went to Hillel for Shabbat dinner with friends and whatever. So I was sort of involved, but not politically. And then from that, Students for Justice in Palestine stuff, then I started getting really involved because I was like, who are these assholes? And why are they spreading all this nonsense? So then I started looking at what the actual facts were, and I saw how ridiculous all this stuff was. And once I saw how fierce the opposition was, then I was like, okay, I have to be more active. I have to do something about it. And that's really how I got involved with the Israel stuff. And then I think at the time I interned with a pro-Israel organization, and then I worked part-time. So it really took off from there, on campus. And then because of what I did, I worked on a few political campaigns on the digital side. That's sort of how it was a natural transition to start doing a lot of activism for and about Israel on social media. So it started just sort of as myself. And then I worked with a number of different organizations over the years for about 10 years now, 11 years, doing different forms of Israel education, Israel advocacy, political campaigning, depending on what the issue is over the years. So, yeah.
You're like Larry David, he opened a spite store because the guy with the coffee shop annoyed him. you're like a spite career. You guys annoyed me. This is what I'm going to do now forever.
Yep. I mean, it works. Yeah. I guess that's the ultimate failure on their part, because if they had just not been so, psychotic, then I would never have been an Israel activist. But because they were, here I am in Israel. So.
Thank you, guys. We thank you. Well, the thing is, I remember maybe 4 years ago, it was Israeli Independence Day, and I was walking around just randomly in Washington Square Park back in New York City. And this wasn't political in any way, shape, or form. It was just an Independence Day, and there were maybe, 100 people celebrating. They had flags in hand, and there was some, music, and they were just having a good time. and there were maybe 20 people kind of sitting down in protest, right? Like they had like Free Palestine stuff, and I was like, it is impossible. This is the only country where it's impossible to separate anything. It's just it's political in its nature. Like people cannot just go and celebrate their Independence Day, a little celebration, like 100 people in the middle, in like I don't know, it was like off to the right hand side. It wasn't like even in the main area of Washington Square Park. Even then, they had to make it political, which is just, it just kind of goes to show that it's impossible to break away from that.
Yeah. I think the thing that's been like, that I've seen over the years is that like when I was at USC, they were very obnoxious and they would come and they would protest all kinds of events like you just mentioned. And that was like problematic for me because a lot of the claims that they make are incorrect. Not that you can't criticize Israel, of course, but like the way that they do it is just wrong. Like they're saying things that are just objectively untrue. But what sort of shifted over the years is that it's become like okay for these, some of these activists and some of these groups to just like target random Jewish kids. Like instead of protesting the USC students for Israel, now they're protesting Hillel. Like, and they don't see that like there is a line, you can criticize Israel. But
can you explain what Hillel is, maybe for people who don't know, for listeners who don't know?
Yeah, sure. So Hillel is like one of the largest Jewish life organizations on campuses. They have like, I guess, hundreds, maybe thousands of Hillel houses on campus, and they host like Shabbat dinners and different. There's like a rabbi there and like a director who puts on events, and it's not political. It's not like a political thing. It's like a Jewish cultural center, the same way as there would be a Muslim cultural center or a Christian cultural center. It's not something for Israel. It's for Jewish life, for American Jews, or also Canadian. I guess they're also in Canada. Canadian Jews. It has nothing to do with Israel. And yet we see, especially recently, sort of a conflation of that with Israel from the other side, like attacking Hillel. And also Chabad. Chabad is another like major Jewish organization, a bit more religious, that they have across all different campuses. And we saw like even with this last wave of violence this month in May, that several Chabad houses not on campuses, or actually one of them was on campus, I think, were being like vandalized with swastikas, or, they're spray painting Free Palestine. Like spray painting Free Palestine on a Jewish institution is anti-Semitic. I don't know why that's so difficult for people to understand. It's not a political statement to go to a Jewish institution and say Free Palestine, to vandalize it with Free Palestine. But apparently some people don't understand this. So.
Why do you think it's become so, here in politics, it's very binary. Take any issue, there's no middle ground. It's like abortion, we know where that stands, right? Climate change, you know where that stands. Immigration, you know where it's... Why does the Israel-Palestine fall so far? Like, I just feel like it's almost the other way around, as the way it should be. It's the other way around. And I'm always like confused why it's Israel is the one that's vilified. I think it's maybe I mean, you can probably better than I can do, but it seems like there is a what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know. The vilification of it is just very, very, very weird for me. By the left, essentially, and not by the right.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that behind a lot of it, and I hate saying this because it almost sounds like a cop-out. Oh, it's anti-Semitism. But there is an element. There is an element that's just old school anti-Semitism. It's that people have a problem with Jews. They always have. Unfortunately, it looks like they always will. And we have to constantly be vigilant about educating people. That's part of the reason why like Holocaust education and this type of stuff is important. It's not just for cautioning future generations about other genocides. It's also because like it's too easy. And I don't know why. It really doesn't make sense why people have always had a problem with Jews, because they're different, or because they don't assimilate enough, or because they... whatever. In different times in history, it's been It's been different things because they're successful. Some of it has been envy in different places in the world and continues to be today. But there's definitely an element, I think, of just pure anti-Semitism when it comes to the irrational obsession with Israel. And the problem is that people who don't understand that, they don't listen when we say that it's anti-Semitism. They think, oh yeah, you're just trying to excuse, criticism of Israel. No, we're not. Like the fact that the international press, for example, is obsessed with Israel to the point where there is literally a genocide occurring in China. Mm-hmm. And that gets like, a few articles here and there. But oh my gosh, there's rockets and airstrikes in Israel between Israel and Hamas. And this like dominates the international press for 3 weeks. Never mind that, there's teenagers getting abducted and raped and killed in Afghanistan en masse. Never mind that there's terrorist attacks in other countries. Never mind anything else that's happening in the world. Israel becomes like the number one thing. And this is a form of anti-Semitism, the obsession. And I think that there's never been an answer, or they've never been required to answer why this is the case with international media. I know it gets ratings, so that's part of the motivation from their perspective. But at the end of the day, the disproportionality, like they always want to talk about how Israel is disproportional with Palestinians. Mm-hmm. The press is disproportional. They're disproportional in how they cover the conflict. And obviously there's a bias against Israel in a lot of the international press. But even if there wasn't, the fact that they talk about Israel all the time doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense. It's not the only issue in the world. And I think that like one of the things that we saw, I'm not a fan of Trump, never have been, but one of the things that we saw with the Abraham Accords and how it shifted things is that it really proved that whole line of thinking wrong. That, the key to peace in the Middle East is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. No, it's not. Yeah. It's not, and it never has been. And if we put all of this conflict with all the terrible things that, we deal with, it's still not that much more significant in any regard in terms of like the actual warfare, in terms of the death toll on both sides. It's not that bad compared to everything else in the world. And people lose sight of that completely. And social media has made it worse by like 1,000 times.
Yeah. I think what I was trying to refer to earlier, when I think of liberal values, right? I would think that Israel aligned with liberal values much better. Just as an example, right? 22 Arab nations, 45 Islamic countries, all with overwhelming Muslim majority, like 95 to 100% Muslim, right? Israel, one tiny Jewish state, only one who's democratic, liberal, multicultural, gender equality, rights for all, Jewish, Muslim, doesn't matter. And the Muslims in the government, right? Only country, I think, non-Muslim country in the world. 20% of the country is Arab, and they serve in every office imaginable. And then you call us an apartheid country? I mean, what kind of upside down delusional world are we living in where we can't say what the facts are?
Yeah. No, I understand you completely. And it's true that when it comes to liberal values, even progressive values, there's no comparison. I think
it's not even close.
Yeah, I think that as a result of what I was saying before, as a result of the disproportionate coverage and how it's covered, what happens in Israel, people just don't know. Like, if you don't care about the issue, either you're intentionally lying and going against Israel, or you're someone who is actually digging and trying to find something. If you're just ambivalent, well, then your default, increasingly so, is going to be anti-Israel, because all you hear is things that are factually untrue, like the apartheid accusation. And I think that it's like things like this are really, these emotionally charged terms are really dangerous. And they have an impact, as we're seeing now, on Jewish communities outside of Israel too, because people start latching on to these like super emotionally charged and inflammatory terms and this rhetoric that's been normalized. When I was at USC, it was like a few crazy people who everyone thought was crazy except like the Communist Club, which was, all of 15 people at USC too. That's ironic. But except for these people, everybody thought they're nuts. Yeah. Nuts. And now you have Ilhan Omar in US Congress and AOC and Rashida Tlaib standing on the House floor saying Israel is ethnic cleansing, even though the population of Palestinian has, quadrupled since 48 even. They say that there's apartheid, even though we now have an Islamist, not just Arab, an Islamist party in the coalition. Like it doesn't make sense. And I actually had an argument. The new government was sworn in yesterday. Yeah. I had an argument on Twitter with a woman who I actually had previously debated on BBC, who was saying that, well, yeah, just because there's Arabs in the government doesn't mean there's not apartheid. Naftali Bennett is a racist, fascist, blah, blah, blah. And I responded like, listen, you can criticize Naftali Bennett, you can oppose his policies, but you cannot say that Israel is apartheid because it's actually untrue. That's exactly what that means, that there are Arabs in the government, that it is not apartheid. Yeah. And you're just repeating things in order to get people upset and to incite against Israel because you don't like it. Not everything you don't like is apartheid. Not everything you don't like about Israel is ethnic cleansing. And not everything Israel does wrong is ethnic cleansing or apartheid or genocide.
Yeah.
And yet people just completely lose sight of this. And then they hear over and over again, oh, apartheid, oh, ethnic cleansing. And people don't know what the facts are. Last week there was a TikToker with sorry, I'm talking so much.
No. This is why this platform is so great, because this isn't. No one's cutting you off. No one's gonna edit you. You can talk as long as you want.
Okay. So last week I saw that there's a blonde American girl, doesn't live here, not Jewish, I don't think at least, and she did a video about how Israel is in the wrong because every day they're bombing Palestinian children. Every day. What? No one's bombing anyone. They're not bombing us. We're not bombing them. Nothing is happening with children. And nobody cares. This has 10 million views. Yeah. 10 million views. And nobody thought to Google, what's going on in Israel? What's going on in Israel today? And this is a new video. It's not from the war. It's a new video that she made.
The problem is the algorithm is not a fact checker. The algorithm is looking for the most engagement, and inflammatory and sensationalist headlines and clickbait titles will get that. So the more people, all you need to do is look on YouTube, the what do you call them? The little squares where you see what the picture is of the video. And, half of them is just unrelated to the video itself, right? But you'll click on it because it looks interesting. And that's what it is. So you can get away with anything nowadays because it doesn't matter. I'm not a media company. You can say, I can say what Bella Hadid, right? She put out that stupid video. I don't even know if she saw the debunking of it. Maybe she did, maybe she didn't. But it was brilliant, by the way. I loved it. But we're living in a post-truth era, it seems. Yeah. And no one really cares. No one cares about the truth when it is against their truth. When it's for their truth, everyone cares. But when it's something else, then it's I don't know, it's this and that and the other. So it really does feel like we're living in a post-truth era.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. I think that social media has had a huge role in this, and it's really frightening.
Which one's the worst, do you think? Which social media platform's the worst? Twitter. Actually,
now TikTok.
Okay.
But other than TikTok, Twitter. Twitter has been for a while. They're the least compliant and always have been when it comes to issues with terrorist organizations and how bots also at the behest of countries. There was just discovered that Iran is behind a bunch of bots that were tweeting anti-Semitic things, and not Israel is bad, whatever. They were tweeting phrases like Hitler is right. En masse.
Yeah. That was trending. Yeah.
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 Yeah. So we know that there are countries who are using, and Turkey also is a huge country that's used a lot of social media campaigns, we'll say, with bots to promote certain messaging. In the case of Turkey, a lot of them were focused on criticizing people who criticized Erdogan, for example. But they've also done stuff, organized efforts against Israel on social media. Russia does a lot of this as well. And I think that the social media networks, they're always like a step behind, it seems, both with incitement. In 2015, I was very active also in, through working with social media companies through Knesset, because there was a Knesset inquiry as to social media's refusal to remove Arabic incitement to violence that was fueling dozens of stabbing attacks and car ramming attacks in Israel. And I remember that I spoke in a Knesset committee about like how severe it was. And everybody said, and this was like midway through, there had been, 30, we'll say, attacks. And then I think there were another 20 or so after this. And everybody said like, oh, yes, this is a problem. This is a problem. Oh, we're working on it. We're working on it. What is working on it? You have people who are reporting anti-Semitic and explicit calls to violence, and your community standards aren't removing it.
Yeah.
Like there is no working. You working on it means more people are dead tomorrow. Like, and then, they dealt with it. And actually after that, Facebook has been pretty good about dealing with like clear-cut incitement to violence. But then we see another phenomenon, another wave of something. Then you see the electoral interfering. That happened a few years after. And then, only after the fact, then they, play catch up and, we'll deal with it this way. We'll deal with it that way. And now same thing. You have all kinds of anti-Semitism. And last year I did like a huge social media campaign for adopting the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which it's like a framework that includes different forms of anti-Semitism today. And some of them include how anti-Zionism is used as like a replacement word for classical anti-Semitism. So, people would say, I don't hate Jews. I just hate Zionists. Mm-hmm. Because they want to kill all Palestinian babies.
Yeah.
So we know that all you have to do is replace the word Zionist with Jews, and this is a classic anti-Semitic trope. But it's okay to say anti-Zionist because somehow that is supposed to be legitimate criticism of Israel. So this definition is a consensus organization of different Jewish organizations and leaders who said, like, no, this is anti-Semitism, and this has real-world consequences. So a lot of different organizations, both Jewish and non-Jewish, and universities even have adopted this as sort of a framework of approaching anti-Semitism wherever it may manifest, and social media networks have not. So we were saying one of the largest promoters, I guess, even if inadvertent, of anti-Semitism is on social media today, and they need to be better equipped at dealing with it and removing it or educating about it, putting like a warning about the content that people are posting, whether it's Holocaust denial or something else. And it took them like a year at least to do anything.
Yeah.
Anything. Until last year, Holocaust denial was allowed on almost all of the platforms except Google. Like when I started this campaign. Yeah. Now, TikTok and Facebook and Twitter have all said that Holocaust denial is not permitted. The only place I've really seen a significant change has been Facebook, which is still, it's an ongoing process. They're working all the time. But like Twitter when Jack was interrogated, I don't know if that's the right word, but when Jack was interviewed, we'll say, by the U.S. Congress, he said explicitly that they wouldn't remove Holocaust denial, even though they had already changed their policy to say that they would. I mean, they're all over the place. Yeah. They're all over the place. And only once you see, Jews are actually being targeted on the streets in Los Angeles. Jews are being beat up in Times Square. Jews are being attacked in London. And there are crazy pro-Palestinians driving through the streets chanting about raping Jews. Then, anti-Semitism is a problem. We should do something about that. Where were you the last year and a half when we were trying to get you to reframe how you approach anti-Semitism on your platform? And I think it's really important that I say this doesn't mean censoring everybody. Mm-hmm. Like, even if you want to criticize or critique Zionism, go for it. But you can't make generalized, overarching statements that say, only the Jews don't have the right to self-determination, and only the Jews can be criticized for certain behaviors. And I don't hate Jews, I just hate Zionists. Like, you can't. Another example, SJP on campus. There was a video that went viral. An American now, a Holocaust survivor, never lived in Israel, not an Israeli citizen. He spoke on a campus about hate speech. I think this was a year and a half ago already. An SJP student stands up and demanded that he condemn Israel's oppression of Palestinians.
Yeah.
And the thing is that, like, obviously this is anti-Semitic. Demanding that Jews who have nothing to do with Israeli policy answer for the policies of the state of Israel is outrageous. But so many people thought like that's fine. It was like only the Jewish community largely that thought that this was problematic when I saw this video going around.
It's also funny that, like, if you think about, I don't know, let's just take the last two wars, right? Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, off the top of my head, I don't know what the numbers are, but I would have to guess hundreds of thousands of people killed by the U.S. Army in those two wars. So if we're just talking number wise, it's not even close. Like all the wars combined between like Palestinians, Gaza, West Bank, etc., and Israel, they don't even scratch that anywhere close to that number. So if we're just talking number wise, but why isn't that applicable if you are placing people with government? Why isn't that applicable to U.S. citizens, you would say, right? But no one's telling U.S. citizens, hey, why don't you start, condemning your government that's killed all these, Muslim people across. It's just such a, I don't know, but forget that. That's a side note. It just drives me crazy, the stupidity of it. But if we're talking about, censorship and free speech on social media, that's something that I'm always conflicted. On the one hand, if we are going to have free speech, right, without incitement, that's also like, it can't be subjective. It's like, if you want to do free speech for everything, I'm fine with that. Like Wild West, let everyone say whatever they want about any topic, any subject. But then if you're going to, ban Trump or ban people that dead name people, meaning like calling them by their former name, but then you're going to keep the spiritual leader of Iran when he says we're going to annihilate Israel, then it's like, all right, this isn't a level playing field. You got one set of rules for one people and then another set of rules for something else. And it just kind of not really objective. It's up to the whims of the social media gods, whatever they feel is the most popular thing. And that's what they'll go on. So at that point, it's like, okay, now we see what side or what camp you're on.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, my approach, and not everyone, like even in this field and in the Jewish community, agrees with me, but my opinion is that I don't think they should remove anti-Semitic content. If the content would be legally prosecutable, like actually something that can be proven to incite violence, that could be proven in a court, remove it.
Yeah.
Everything outside of that, I'm not in favor of removing. I'm in favor of them putting something over it or under it or a warning so that people can learn more about this information. I think that they should use it as an educational tool, and not just for Jews with anti-Semitism, but also for other forms of hate as well. People want to post like crazy homophobic stuff. Okay, put a warning on it. And it's their choice to use this platform. It's their choice to use Facebook or Twitter or whatever. And if they don't like it, they don't have to use it. It's a private company. But I do think that the companies, even though they're private, have an obligation to the public to do something in order to educate it, because we've seen the consequences when they don't. So I'm not a fan of censorship in almost any way. But I do think that there needs to be something done to educate people also about different forms, different racism, against anti-Black racism, for example. I don't think it should just go scot-free. I think it should be called out, but not necessarily removed. And you know what? I also think it's important that people see that these forms of bigotry exist. I know people personally who really don't think, for example, that racism exists in America anymore. Of course, racism exists in America. Of course it does. Of course it's an issue. Is it as much as some people say? Maybe, maybe not. You can debate about that all you want, but the reality is that there is racism in America today, just like there's anti-Semitism, and people need to understand that. And we need these examples to be able to point out also as warnings that this type of rhetoric or this type of behavior is not acceptable. And we can't do that if people think it doesn't exist.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it exists everywhere. Think that's why when I sometimes hear people say, "Oh, America's the most racist country," I'm like, you haven't traveled, like you haven't been to many places. I'm assuming, because it's probably the least racist, one of the most progressive, especially now, countries in the world. Is it number one? I don't know. Is it one of the leading ones? For sure. There's a lot of catch up to do in a lot of countries, and yeah, it's just it's a wrong statement to put out there. But I want to go over a few things just so people can maybe have the facts. I saw that you put out a great video again about what happened in Schrader. And maybe you can explain to people, because again, misinformation, what the story was not actually what happened. So can you maybe break it down for people what exactly happened?
Sure. So one of the prevailing myths about Israel is that Israel's existence required Israel to expel Palestinians en masse from their homes, and that it was their land and their country, and that the Jews just came in and took it from them. And this is an intentional and organized effort to disguise what the reality of the situation is around Israel's founding. Now, I'm not saying that no one was expelled, because some Palestinians were, or they weren't Palestinians at the time, but some Arabs were. A lot of them fled also, and a lot of them stayed and are now citizens. So the truth is obviously more complex, but that's not easy for people to pay attention to. So they just hear, oh, yes, Israel is expelling Palestinians from their home and has been since 48. This is what led to the narrative of Sheikh Jarrah and what's happening even now. The reality is that this specific property in Jerusalem, was purchased by a Jewish person in 1874, and under the Ottomans, when the Ottomans controlled this area, and they maintained ownership of this land. There was nothing on it at the time until they sold it to like another Jewish organization in the 40s, I think it was. It was transferred several times to different Jewish individuals or organizations throughout the British occupation of Jerusalem, and then after that, even the Jordanian occupation. Now, when the Jordanians occupied East Jerusalem, they built several homes or buildings, apartment homes for Palestinian families there. They didn't give them the homes, they didn't have ownership of it, but they were built for them to live in. The Palestinians have never owned these homes, the families who are there, and they have no evidence that they have, which is why there's a conflict now. Because the actual owners of the property, who do have the literal deed, went to the Israeli courts after the unification of Jerusalem and wanted to obtain that property back or collect rent, as they were the legal owners. And it's also important to note that Jewish people were expelled by the Jordanians when they occupied East Jerusalem. The Jews that were from there, the Jews that had lived there even for hundreds of years, were expelled by the Jordanians. So this is also when the city of Jerusalem was unified. It was the first time that the owners of the property had access to it either. So when they went to appeal to the courts asked them to come to a mediation or agreement together. Palestinians who lived there refused and said that they weren't going to pay rent because they were the owners, even though they had no proof that they were the owners. And then this turned into a lengthy court battle over 10 years, and it's still ongoing because these families and their future generations have refused to pay rent, basically. And as a result of that, the courts decided that some of the not all of them, but some of these houses in question where they couldn't prove any sort of ownership and the other side could, and they hadn't paid rent for years, should be evicted on the basis of not paying their rent. Now, obviously, this is more complex than a simple real estate dispute. I see people responded to my video even saying like, oh, well, that's insulting to say it's just a real estate dispute. It's not. It's an unpleasant situation for everyone involved. It's very, very difficult. And I'm sure it's very painful and upsetting for Palestinian families who have lived there for several generations to feel like they're being thrown out of their homes. But they didn't own the property. Yeah. And that's the point. They didn't own it. They never owned it. And they can't prove that they owned it. Well, someone else can. And that sucks.
And they never wanted to pay either. They were reluctant to pay.
Exactly. No, they didn't have to be kicked out of their homes. They could have paid. They didn't want to out of a political ideology, I guess. Mm-hmm. And yeah, that sucks. And I understand their motivation. But to say that it's Israel is kicking Palestinians out of their homes again is not true. It's just not true. And it conflicts with all of the facts on the ground about this case. I mean, the New York Times wrote an article that was like 4,000 words about this entire Sheikh Jarrah case. And not once did they mention that the Palestinians don't have ownership of the land, period. And never did.
Yeah.
So there's been a lot of, I guess, evasion of the facts of the case. And, it's not an ideal situation. I don't think that, I don't know. It's not like I know the organization that owns the property legally, but I don't think that they even would have wanted this, or they would never have proposed that the Palestinians who live there can pay rent. This wasn't an organized and concerted effort by the Israeli government to expel Palestinians from their home. It wasn't. Yeah. Even though other people are saying that. And they're also criticizing the courts and saying, oh, well, the courts are biased. And of course, they're ruling against Palestinians. These are the same courts that have thrown Jews out of their home when they were illegally built. And the Israeli courts regularly rule against Israelis. This happens all the time, whether it's illegal buildings or evictions or whatever. The Israeli court system is criticized within Israel for being too left.
Yeah.
Too in favor of the Palestinians. So there's just a total lack of understanding about the facts of the case. And the result has been that people with ulterior motives like Hamas, like Iran, even like the Palestinian Authority, have used this to incite within their own communities against Israel, to launch protests, violent protests, like what happened to Al-Aqsa, and then ultimately, like we saw in May, to launch a war. So this is the extreme, but the danger of just not giving a shit about facts.
Yeah. And that's the crux of it. I think the wars we have, if you look out from 48 and all the different wars we've had, largely we've been successful. And even now with the technology and with the advanced intel and information and the army that we have, that part, I feel like we've got it down. I don't know what will happen in the future, but for now, we're definitely losing on the social media aspect. And I was thinking just sheer numbers, it's almost impossible to win. If you have, 14 million Jews across the world, roughly 12 to 14 million, something like that. And then you have over 1 billion Muslims. And then you have a lot of people who support them as well. It's a David and Goliath type numbers. That's not really something that you can thwart, that you can go up against. And I mean, I see, you guys, and I see other people, obviously, and that do it, but it almost seems sometimes like a drop in the ocean. Like, do you feel like that sometimes, or do you kind of?
I mean, of course, because at the end of the day, social media is a numbers game, and we will always lose because there's not that many of us, or not as many. People always say, "Oh, Israeli Hezbollah is so bad. It's so bad. They never do anything." We're like, how many million people? If every single Israeli was super active and dedicated their life to Hezbollah, guess what? We would still be outnumbered. Yeah. The rest would still be skewed against Israel. So I think that there's a somewhat unreasonable expectation from like Jewish community and also from Israelis when it comes to Hezbollah. That being said, the problem is that if we do nothing and if we just don't engage, and I know a lot of people who agree with me, but like, I can't be bothered. Like, I don't want to get involved in all this like social media stuff because it's so ugly. On the one hand, they're right. On the other hand, you never know who's going to see your stuff. It may be someone who has tremendous influence, even if it's only one person. I mean, look at how much problems Bella Hadid caused. Mm-hmm. So that's
I didn't even know about her up until a few months ago. I've never even heard that name.
Yeah,
Maybe that's just me.
She's just for taking pictures. She's not known for her
intellectual prowess. Yeah.
Yes. But yeah, I mean, you don't know who's going to see it, and the problem is that if there's nothing on the other side, then there's no debate, and people don't know that there's even another side represented. So at this point, it isn't even about winning the battle on social media. It's about showing that there is a battle and that there is another side, and about influencing the people that we can influence and building relationships with the people who we can build relationships with or allyships with. Because the alternative is far worse. And we see that when the lies go unaddressed, they get more extreme, and it continues to happen. So that's the reason that I think it's so important to continue to be involved. And even though what I saw this time with the conflict was that the anti-Semitism in response that I received, I've never seen this level of hate. I've never seen it. And before it was always like, oh, you're a pro-Israel troll, cursing at me and stuff. I got thousands of death threats.
Really?
Thousands. I've never had that happen. There was a call on like the dark web to hack all of my accounts.
Wow.
Unfortunately for them, I also work with a cybersecurity company, so good luck.
Yeah.
But
that's scary.
Yeah.
Scary.
Like attacks. There were a bunch of Malaysians who like made memes of my face. There was someone who made a fake account saying that this was the real. Luckily, my account's verified, but they made a fake Twitter account of me and started messaging and tweeting at people who follow me. I'm a slut.
Oh wow!
Like crazy stuff. And part of that is because like I'm a huge activist. So that's not going to happen to somebody who's like, actually, I support Israel. For the most part, you might get some comments. It's not going to be at that level. So I don't want to like scare people. But at the same time, there is a concerted effort to silence people who are speaking up on social media, especially during times of conflict. And I know it sounds crazy because it's counterintuitive, but that's another reason that it's so important to fight back. Yeah. Because it can't be that we have, millions of Jews around the world and supporters of Jews who just like are afraid to talk about anything because people are going to dox them and post crazy shit on their accounts and all of the stuff that does happen sometimes when you have big activists. But it's unacceptable. Yeah. And I think that we also need to call on social media networks to be much more aggressive about this. That account that I mentioned, for example, it still is up. But like Twitter removed like certain messages. That's crazy. That's crazy. It's obviously a concerted effort to make a fake account in my name with my picture, which by the way is a copyright infringement. Yet Twitter doesn't say that this is against the rules. Like there's no legal basis for that. This is not legitimate criticism or commentary, even under US law. Like someone is using your photos that you have the copyrights to, it's illegal. I could sue the person, except they're in Malaysia.
and who knows how real they are.
Yeah. Yeah. But these social media networks, they have an obligation to remove content like this. And they don't, or at least not fast enough. And that's a huge problem. Actually, just last week, there's another example. Muna El-Kurd, who is one of the Schrader like activists. She and her brother are like huge activists that are on the international media tour about how Israel makes their life horrible and on and on and on. So she has posted for years photos of her role model, whom she calls her role model, Dalal Mughrabi, who is the Palestinian terrorist who was responsible for the Coastal Road massacre, in which 38 Israelis were killed and 13 children. And it's her phone cover. She has like a picture taking a selfie. Fatah, which is the Palestinian political party of Mahmoud Abbas in the West Bank, they posted a photo of her praising her and saying, "Oh, you're just like your role model. We're so proud of you." Yeah. I reported this. I got a message from Facebook saying that this wasn't against their terms. So glorifying someone who murdered 13 children isn't against their community standards. Now, eventually the photo was removed, but why did it take them a week to remove it? How is that acceptable? Meanwhile, all these other Palestinians see it and think, oh yes, it's totally cool to glorify a child killer.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of conflation with what's happening here with social issues and then what's going on in other parts of the world, which is a problem. But I saw this stat recently. It said Spain translates more books into Spanish each year than the entire Arab world has translated into Arabic since the 9th century. More books are translated into Hebrew, a country with less than 10 million people, than in Arabic, hundreds of millions of people each year. So most of the content they consume online is in Arabic as well. They're essentially closed off from getting balanced, nuanced perspective on many, many, many issues. And they're almost in the dark with regards to like so much information. And that kind of just sparked that, because when you said, I don't know any other country that terrorists are being glorified, like here in the US, like who are the stars? Who do kids look up to? LeBron James, right? Or I don't know, some other football star or some baseball star. Go to Europe, it's football, it's Ronaldo, it's Messi. In Israel, it's, I don't know, same thing, right? Like no kid is glorifying and saying, ooh, I wish I could be like this terrorist that killed 13 kids. But here I don't want to say it's standard, but it's common.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that like one of the, I don't want to say mistakes, but we'll say shortcomings of Oslo from the beginning. They were supposed to, when Israel and the Palestinians signed this peace agreement, education and not teaching hate to Palestinians and also Israelis was part of it. And this is something that we see has not only been, not only has the Palestinian leadership failed on, they've done the opposite. And they've glorified people who are openly and explicitly violent. They have an entire ministry that's paying people who carry out acts of terrorism. And this is like a publicly known fact. There are some countries who are like, oh, we need to re-examine aid, but somehow the aid keeps coming through. Yeah. Even though we know that the Palestinian Authority is paying terrorists. And the part that's most crazy to me is that, let's say Mahmoud Abbas wants to stop this. He can't. Yeah. He can't, because the public opinion would go against him, because they've created a society in which they've educated the public to think one thing. And so because they've educated the public to think one thing, they can't make a change because the public will go against them and then will, vote when they have elections, if they ever have elections, for Hamas, or they'll forcibly overthrow Fatah, which is also a possibility. And then you have terrorists controlling the West Bank, just like they control Gaza now. So the incitement is it's almost like a vicious cycle, because they educate about it and then they have more of it. And then because they have more of it, then they glorify it and they educate it more. At some point, they have to change their approach. There has to be somebody with leadership and enough power and respect in the Palestinian society to make this change. And we just don't see anything like that right now. Not even, not from Hamas, who obviously doesn't want that. But let's say they did. They don't have enough power. Yeah. And definitely not from Fatah. So there's nobody who can make that sort of cultural change in how they view things in order to show that, like, okay, this is not a good thing. And the part that's really alarming to me is that we see the opposite happening abroad. We see the normalization of glorifying people who are violent, which is, what you see with the El Kurd twins. I mean, they're on MSNBC, CNN, really? Talking about how Israel is so terrible to them, and on their Facebook publicly, Mohammed El Kurd does most of his stuff in English too. It's not like it's in Arabic. Mm-hmm. He's whitewashing Al Qaeda and saying that Al Qaeda is actually the fault of the United States. He's celebrating the burning of American flags. He's regularly bashing and calling for violence, obviously against Israelis, but also against Americans. Mm-hmm. And nobody cares. Nobody cares about this. They have, just this morning, I saw a picture on Muna El Kurd social media. It was older. It was from a few years ago, but like a photo of Hitler, about how she wants him to play. It was a picture of Hitler and his girlfriend, and how she wants to hear the music that she was singing in the picture. Like, why are you posting pictures of Hitler, and why is everyone okay with this?
Psychotic.
Did no one think that this is problematic? People are normalizing and excusing this behavior, and we see the same thing with Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar. Okay, maybe they're not posting pictures of Hitler, but the rhetoric that they're using at a time when Israel was literally taking 4,500 rockets at civilians, which even one is a war crime, they're standing on the House floor saying, and Ilhan Omar said that Israeli airstrikes targeting Hamas facilities exclusively are terrorism.
Yeah.
That Israel self-defense at all is terrorism.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
But American drone strikes in Pakistan is freedom. So, I know you have to go in a couple of minutes, so I just want to ask you a question. When we're seeing we're barely scratched the surface. Like we could have this conversation for another 3 hours and we won't even touch on 50% of the stuff I want to ask you. But when we're seeing stuff like, when we're seeing all the fake pictures and the fake news and the stories and edited videos, right? Like we're seeing a lot of stuff also just completely false, right? There's a whole hashtag Pollywood where they're actually creating fabricated stories of things that are not happening, and then they're editing it and sending it to the media as if they're facts or if there's something that's happened, but it didn't really happen. And then with Hamas, right, they will show you very horrific pictures of like a kid that got hit by a rocket. Israel will never do that because they respect the family. So whenever Hamas rocket hits a 6-year-old in Israel, out of respect for the family, they will show a picture of the kid, like a nice picture, but they will never show the person that got hit. And for viewers, when they see that, okay, here's the one kid that's maimed, horrific. The people who did this are horrific, and then they see this other picture, which is just like a nice kid. I don't think it doesn't sell the same, right? It's for lack of a better term. What can And I don't know if you have the answer, because this is almost like an impossible answer, but what can Israel do in this era of social media where everyone is a broadcaster and algorithms decide what goes viral? How do you put forth a story that resonates with people in this sea of misinformation? Like, I do feel sometimes like it's a losing battle, but are there tactics, are there strategies that we can implement? Like, what are things that people can do to get the story across in a better way?
So I think that there's a few different things that we can do. The first thing that's important to do is obviously, and this is the least effective, so I'll start with this, is obviously correcting when there's misinformation and calling it out. And another aspect of this that's super important is that you identify the lack of credibility in the person who's talking about it or the person who's claiming it. So when they say 200 people died in Gaza, well, yes, and that's sad. Obviously, we don't want that. Yeah. But those numbers are coming from Hamas because Hamas controls the Ministry of Health. Yeah. So let's just wait and not freak out about it until we have independent people reviewing what actually occurred, or at least seeing what the other side, meaning Israel, is saying about which people they targeted that were terrorists, how many civilian casualties there were. And that's a very difficult place to be in because of the things that you just mentioned. It's hard to respond with the death of a child, which obviously is a tragedy, with, okay, but let's look at the facts. Yeah. You need to, but it's not what our initial reaction is as human beings. We want to say like, wow, this is outrageous. Someone needs to be held accountable for it. Unfortunately, that's part of war. And that's the reality that you're dealing with when you deal with situations like a terrorist organization that is a few kilometers from Israeli citizens. Yeah. So again, it's same as Sheikh Jarrah. Like there is no easy answer. It's an unpleasant situation for everybody. It's not what we want. Israel doesn't want to kill kids, and they do a lot in order to avoid this, which is why you have footage that, the army calling off airstrikes because there are children around. Whenever there's content like this, it's important to put out, even if it's not the most compelling message, even if it's not the best response, it's still important to say. And then also when the IDF calls, they call to evacuate buildings every time. So it's important to show this information. And one of the
Which, by the way, no other army in the world does that.
Of course. And that's also important to mention. So all these things need to be said. It's content that needs to be put out if and when it's available. And Israel as a country has an obligation, especially the army, to get this out as soon as possible, whenever and wherever it occurs. That's their role. Our role, and other supporters of Israel, or just other people who want to present a more accurate picture of what's happening, their role is to amplify those messages and to try to call for more reasonable and nuanced debate. Now, the other thing that I think is really important that people are missing, and this doesn't just apply to Israel, is that the entire narrative of the state of Israel is under attack. And that's part of the reason that there's disproportionate focus on Israel whenever there's a conflict. But it's not about it just being a conflict. It's about the existence of the state of Israel for a lot of people, especially critics. I think that it's really important that we change the way that we talk about the foundation of the state of Israel and the reason it exists in the first place. Israel doesn't exist because of the Holocaust or because of anti-Semitism. Israel exists because Jews are indigenous to this land, and Jews were here for thousands of years, and Jews were colonized also by Arabs, by multiple groups, and expelled repeatedly. So if you want to talk about social justice, and you want to talk about being woke, and you want to talk about fighting for justice in all the ways that people who use this to criticize Israel today, accusing it of colonialism and things like this, it's the opposite. Yeah. It's the opposite. And my personal political beliefs, I'm not a fan of like the victimhood, contest. But if you want to talk about victimhood, fine. There is no more oppressed people in the history of humanity than the Jewish people. And if I have to go through every single attack that ever occurred in every single country against Jews, we will.
Yeah. It will be a long list.
That needs to be our approach. Yeah, that needs to be our approach. And it's great that the Jewish people are, empowered, and that we have a country, and that we are no longer going to be held back by victimhood. But that doesn't mean we can lose sight of what the reality is, because other people will. Which is what I said before, why Holocaust education is so important. Another thing that has been lost in much of Western culture is the oppression, the massive oppression that Jews in Arab countries face. People don't, even Jews, a lot of Jews in America don't know this.
Many Jews, I wanted to talk about earlier. A million Jews were expelled from Arab nations after World War II. Pogroms, right? Their stuff was stolen. They were beaten. They were murdered. They were chased out of the country. They had to leave all their goods behind. Out of how many countries? 10, 20 countries? How many?
I don't know the exact number. At least 9, because I did a report on 9 different ones. So. And then also you have Iran, which occurred a little bit later because of the Islamic Revolution. Also, it's not technically an Arab country, but same thing, the oppression of the Jewish community, which continues until today. Although they love to say, we have Jews. Yes, as long as they keep quiet and support the regime.
Yeah. And like, how many do you have? Like a couple of thousand? Something like that? Like in total, all the Jews in Arab nations across all the Arab world probably total 10,000, if I'm being generous.
Yeah. And you also see people say, I've had responses in content that I put out about what happened to the Arab, Jews from Arab countries. And they said, well, this happened because of Israel. People did it in response to Israel. So it was just sort of like a byproduct of war. No, that's not the case. If you look at the history in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq was a little bit better prior to the Nazis, actually, because their government under the Nazis, that's why the Farhud happened, which was a pogrom against the Jewish community there by the Muslims. Their government was Nazi allied. Yeah. And that's why that occurred. But in Iraq before that, it was a little bit better for Jews. They were very successful and very wealthy. But like Yemen has oppressed Jews for centuries. They had forced conversion laws. They had a law where they would take the eldest child and force him to be a Muslim and live with a Muslim family. That was the policy. You could be beat up legally if you walked on the wrong side of a Muslim. Like, these were laws on the books in 1800. Like, this wasn't a new phenomenon, the oppression of Jewish minorities under Muslim rule. All throughout the Middle East, this was the case. It has been the case for decades. So to respond to it by saying, oh, well, it's just as a result of, Israel and what Israel did, even though Israel did nothing to those countries in 48 is ridiculous. And so I think it's important to really know our history and be able to talk about it, and to be able to talk about what happened not just like with Ashkenazi history, but also with Mizrahim. It's super, super important because people don't know this stuff. And, you know, in America, there's a misperception that Jews are white. And yeah, some Jews are white passing, on myself, for example. Definitely. And there is like a certain level of privilege when people see someone like that, they assume certain things. Okay, fine. That's true. But no Jew is white. No Jew is white by the standards of how they talk about being white in the scale of, you know, in intersectional thought, I guess. There's no such thing as a white Jew. Yeah. And this is like a very pernicious myth that's been promoted by people like Linda Sarsour in order to delegitimize Jews, not Israel, Jews. And I think it needs to be more aggressively called out. That doesn't mean aggressively be against those people. It means we need to be confident in our history and in our narrative as a people who are returning home. Not exclusive, doesn't mean that Palestinians can't exist, but that's not our issue. Our issue is that Jews are returning home. That's what we need to focus on from day one, whether there's a conflict in Israel or there's not a conflict in Israel. That's the story of the Jewish people, and that's what we need to be confident in. We shouldn't be answering to, oh, well, what do you think about a two-state solution? I mean, maybe as an Israeli, yes, but as a Jew in America, we shouldn't be answering to it. Who cares what some, you know, Shlomo in Los Angeles thinks about whether or not he supports a two-state solution? It's not his job to make a two-state solution.
Yeah.
It's his job to be a Jew who's proud of his identity, who is able to walk confidently with a Magen David without being harassed by people.
Yeah. And
that's what we need to promote. We don't have to answer to anybody who asks about, you know, Palestinian government, Israeli settlements. Who cares? Who cares? Fact of the matter is that Jews should be able to live A, in their homeland where they were ethnically cleansed and expelled from, and B, anywhere they want. Anywhere they want. And I'm not saying that because I support settlements, because politically speaking, I don't.
Yeah.
But it doesn't change the fact that Jews have a right to self-determination the same as any other people. Yes, also Palestinians. And that is something that people lose sight of.
Yeah. And as a side note, whenever the opportunity presented itself over the years to make peace, there was peace. There was peace with Jordan, and there's peace with Egypt, and now with the Abraham Accords, there was 3 new countries and with, you know, Dubai, UAE. Sorry, it seems like there's almost like such a loving relationship between the two nations. Like, I'm dying to get over there. So whenever there's an opportunity, there's no. You know, it's so funny. A few years back, I brought my wife over for the first time to Israel. And after, I don't know, maybe 10 days or so, a week or so, something like that, one of the first things she kind of said to me as just an analysis that she was, you know, going over in her head, she was like, I had no idea how like integrated Arabs and Jews were. She could, because, you know, coming from the US, hearing all the stuff that you hear in the US, she literally thought like, oh, it would be like Jews on one side, Arabs on the other side. And then she was like, no, everywhere you go, it's all mixed together. Yeah. And I'm like, yeah, that's what it is. But people don't get that story, and they don't get that point of view, because all they hear is the bullshit that the media spews.
Yeah.
So there's no hate. I mean, there's hate in the sense that of a neighboring country that's trying to kill you, but there's no deep-rooted hate from Israel for the most part against. There's a willingness to coexist. There's like you said, self-determination, but people want to live together. People want to go to people would love to go to Lebanon or to Saudi Arabia. Like, they would love that, but that's not the reality at the moment.
Yeah, you're totally right. And I think you really hit on something that actually, as being an American and an Israeli, that has been really interesting for me to see, because I think that in the day-to-day, it depends on where you are too, but in the day-to-day, there is not a lot of racism. And again, I'm from California, so it's a little bit different on the street between blacks and whites, for example, with the exception of when there's something that comes up that causes, you know, tensions or whatever, riots, fine. Growing up, I didn't see that much of it, but I knew it existed. And I knew that there are people who harbor a lot of truly racist views in their heart. And maybe not in California, but in some other areas of the country, even if it doesn't always manifest, because there's this history. There's a history of slavery and also after this Jim Crow. And it's different here, even though you see tensions because Israel's dealing with a lot of wars and a lot of conflict. It's different here because you don't really see the same, even when there's racism, which of course there's racism, there are people who are racist. But even from these perspectives, most of the time it's coming from a place where you have terrorism and you have trauma from recent conflict and war. So it's issues that both countries need to deal with and continue to deal with and have dealt with a lot, but there's more work to be done on both sides, but it's very different. And that's why I think comparing Black Lives Matter or whatever to Palestinians is so, does a disservice, honestly, to both sides. Mm-hmm. Because I don't think that, when Black people protest because there is brutality that is completely unnecessary by police, I don't think that you're doing them a service by saying that it's the same thing as Palestinian terrorists. I think that's really insulting to them. And yet we see sort of a conflation, and we saw it especially with this last conflict. People thought that defending Palestinians or Palestinian right to self-defense, there is no Palestinian right to self-defense because Israel isn't fighting Palestinians. Mm-hmm. We were never fighting Palestinian people. We are talking about a terrorist organization, and it's like people didn't understand this. And if they did, well, then that's even worse. Yeah. Because then you're comparing people who in many cases are fighting a just cause, fighting against racism for equality, and you're comparing them to Hamas. It's just crazy. It's crazy to me. They're different things. You can't be Americanizing every conflict. It's not the same thing. It's a different set of circumstances. It's a different background. And it's problematic for both sides when you do so. Probably getting myself into trouble talking about racial relations here.
Yeah. Well, this whole episode is one big getting yourself into trouble episode, so It's fine. But you would see Free Gaza. I'm like, Gaza is free. We're not in Gaza. We left it literally in 2006, and they get funds every year. They could build infrastructure. They could make it a better place. Just like any other country would, right? You have investment, you put that investment into people, into infrastructure, into school, into maybe even tourism or whatever it is that you think can grow the economy, can make it a better place. But instead you go and you build tunnels and billions of dollars worth of money into tunnels and into rockets. Not a good investment. It's not the best ROI, So yeah, anyway, I know it's frustrating. But Emily, I know you got to go. I'm sorry. I kept you longer than I said I would, but it's just, there's a lot to talk about.
Yeah.
What's the best place? Where can people find you online?
So my Instagram is Emily in Tel Aviv, all together, like the TV show, but not in Paris, in Tel Aviv. And my Twitter is Emily K. Schrader, my last name, Schrader. Those are the places I'm most active. I'm also on TikTok and YouTube and Facebook, but I don't use them as much. So for most of the stuff that I do, the content that I make, it's Twitter and Instagram. And then, of course, you can always message me. I'm happy to answer any questions that people have about Israel. I get a lot.
Yeah. Nice messages, please. Nice messages.
Yes. Or mean messages. I don't care. I will just screenshot it and put it on my story. So your name will be out there for everyone. So good luck.
Well, Emily, keep doing awesome work. I think you're one of the few that is really showcasing the truth and doing it in English, which is very necessary because I've seen a few, but Hebrew, it's just not, most people don't know Hebrew. So it's great that someone like you is out there putting out the truth in English. So, in digestible little videos so people can get the truth. So keep doing amazing work. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it. And maybe we'll do it again sometime.
Thanks. It was really fun. We should definitely do it again.
Awesome. All right. Take care, Emily.